Welcome back to the pharmaphorum podcast. In this episode, I speak with Ipsen's head of rare diseases, Jennifer Schranz, about the gap in women's healthcare and how this plays out in the rare disease space, notably rare liver disease, primary biliary cholangitis. There are general themes of healthcare inequality across multiple diseases, Schranz states. Often, women haven't been part of clinical trials in these areas. Then there's the question of appropriate dosages for women as opposed to men. And in rare diseases, this is only amplified. Gender-based science must begin far earlier in the clinical trial process. Tune in for an interesting exploration of personalised medicine and the complexities of women's health. If you've any comments, send them in. And, as ever, thank you for listening. Welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I have with me Jennifer Schranz, head of rare diseases at Ipsen, a global biopharmaceutical company with a focus on bringing transformative medicines to patients in 3 therapeutic areas: oncology, rare disease, and neuroscience. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you, Nicole, for having me today.
So our conversation today will focus on the double jeopardy facing women with rare diseases, like the rare liver disease, primary biliary cholangitis, or PBC. PBC is a rare autoimmune cholestatic liver disease affecting approximately 9 women for every 1 man. A buildup of bile and toxins and chronic inflammation causes irreversible fibrosis or scarring of the liver and destruction of the bile ducts. But you yourself, Jennifer, will talk more to that, won't you?
Yeah, for sure. I'm excited to talk about some of our learnings for one of our recently approved drugs, as well as talk about, in general, some of the gender inequalities in healthcare, which is often amplified in rare diseases.
Absolutely. I mean, it's much spoken about today, and there are substantial knowledge gaps in understanding women's health generally, which we'll also speak about. But perhaps to kick things off, you could tell our listeners a bit more about yourself and your journey to today.
Right. So pleased to do so. So ever since I was a little girl, I wanted to be a physician. So once I did graduate from medical school, I decided to go into infectious diseases. And what I'm really, really honored to have been part of is during the HIV and AIDS pandemic, was able to start a clinic with a collaboration between patient organizations, which were quite vocal at that time to advocate for themselves, the local community hospital and the academic university, and really just being a clinician treating at the front line of this pandemic with the new class of medicines made me, one, passionate about understanding more about drug development. And so that's really how I got into the pharmaceutical trade, was to try to be part of answering the call for unmet need by working on medicines to help make a difference in patients' lives. And so that's really how I got into drug development. And then my passion's always been rare diseases, for the obvious reason that majority of rare diseases have no treatment. Often the voice of the patient is not heard. And with that high unmet need and the need to support that community, it's really a very great honor to be part of the answer, the solution for these patients.
Thank you, Jennifer. So thinking about answering the call and being part of the answer for solutions, let's shift back to what we mentioned briefly a moment ago, which is this topic of women's health more generally and the lack of equity when it comes to therapies and even dosages in existing therapies. So in your opinion, has there been, or rather, why has there been this delay in recognition of the need for trial designs for women and for women's specific conditions?
Right. It's really a very interesting topic. And just in my experience as a clinician and also reading the literature, it looks like there are general themes of healthcare inequality in cardiovascular disease, in diabetes care management, as well as treatment of dyslipidemia. So common diseases, women often haven't been part of the clinical trials. It's really important to note that women and men respond biologically differently to medications, so dosages may need to be different. So I think it really has been a kind of cultural phenomenon where women and their unique healthcare needs have not been really addressed in clinical trials. And so based on this, you can certainly imagine that in rare diseases, that's even amplified. We have smaller numbers of patients. There is heterogeneity of the patient population, and there's really not a lot known about the natural history of diseases. So what we see in common diseases with this inequality is really exaggerated or amplified in rare diseases. And it's really great to see that there's now a specialty or a scientific interest in gender-based science. So it's really important that now we put the unique needs of women into clinical trial designs.
There's been a lot of talk around, in particular, dosing of late, as much as the trial designs themselves. Are you able to comment on that?
Yeah, well, a lot of the times when you do phase 1 studies, where you're doing pharmacokinetics, looking to see how the drug is incorporated into a person's body and how it's metabolized and excreted. Traditionally, it's been only studied in men. So the dosages based on looking at those results in men cannot always be extrapolated to women. And similarly, even for children, you can't think of children being small adults. They handle a drug very differently. And you have to think about a woman's cycle is quite complex. There is kind of a variation on how women respond based often on their hormonal cycles as well. And certainly, as you had mentioned too earlier, in the disease that we hopefully will talk about, primary biliary cholangitis, a lot of the symptoms that the women have are also very similar to menopause. And so that also causes some abnormalities with respect to being diagnosed as well. And so from a drug metabolism perspective, it's really important that women are involved in earlier phase 1 studies so that their response to the drug and how they metabolize or excrete it can also be looked at, because it may be different than men. And there are examples, in medicine where years after a drug gets approved, it turns out that women were getting too high a dose and they've had to reduce that. So I think it's really important with this gender-based science to look at that early, making sure women are represented in the clinical trials.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, so if we turn now to PBC, and just to provide a few more details for listeners, PBC is growing in prevalence and is most commonly diagnosed between the ages of 35 and 55, and it does affect more women than men. And symptoms can include severe fatigue and brain fog, as well as itching, and as you mentioned a moment ago, can be confused with menopause, which results in delaying diagnosis or effective management and leaves many women feeling unheard and isolated. It's a very personal disease, and it does affect everyone differently, and some people may be more symptomatic than others, but their biomarker levels are poor, suggesting the disease is not being controlled even if there are no symptoms at all. So Jennifer, can you go a bit more into further detail about these symptoms and the reason there are the differences and the progression of the disease generally?
Oh, for sure. So primary biliary cholangitis is a chronic progressive autoimmune disease, which is why you often see an increased rate of that in women. What happens is you're getting inflammation of the bile ducts, and that leads to scarring of the liver and cirrhosis. And with that buildup of bile acids or toxins in the liver, that is what's causing the inflammation and the scarring, but also is associated with the symptoms that women feel. So patients can be about up to 60% asymptomatic, but within 10 years of getting this disease, there usually are symptoms. And as you mentioned, the pruritus can be quite severe and debilitating, affecting their ability to sleep and to work. The fatigue is extreme fatigue. If you remember during the recent COVID pandemic, that extreme fatigue where, you couldn't barely get out of bed. So it's not that they're just tired. It's that women are having trouble, and men as they have this disease, in being able to function. So it really affects their quality of life. And their liver dysfunction can be asymptomatic. So their liver can be inflamed and they may not know about it for some time if they aren't getting a blood test that is looking to see if there is that inflammation and abnormality in the liver. Often women will see their physicians and just report these nonspecific symptoms. So fatigue, pruritus, or itching. They may think that they're also the brain fog, which is quite debilitating as well, where they often can't keep their job or have troubles managing their schedules. So with the fatigue, the pruritus, and the brain fog, there could be other diagnoses. And so as we've seen in rare diseases, it takes a long time to get diagnosed. The average time is about 4.7 years to get a diagnosis. And in this, for example, you can imagine that the women are presenting nonspecific symptoms. And so they're either told they're working too hard, or, maybe they have a viral infection, or maybe it's perimenopause or menopause. So, the end result is that women aren't getting the diagnosis on time and not being treated appropriately as quickly as possible. And so that's really the concern that we see in PBC. And so women, as you mentioned, often feel isolated, unheard, because their symptoms are not being taken as a symptom of an underlying liver disease.
Thank you. And before we shift to Ipsen's work in this area, perhaps to provide a more balanced view of sort of an individualized approach, why is it important for this individualization and in the management and treatment of PBC for each patient, if we take it outside of that gender equity box for a second?
Right. I think it's important to look at every patient holistically. Every patient, be it a female or a male, can have their own experience and journey with the disease. So their symptoms could be unique to that person. Their response to those symptoms could be unique to that person. So I think, individualized medicine or personalized medicine is really critical by asking questions, listening to your patient, asking questions, and to ensure that you're an advocate for yourself for the symptoms that you have if you're not getting answers. And also, I think it's really important is to seek support from support groups. I think that's also really critical. And so I think, you have to listen to the patient and holistically treat them, because it's the disease they may have, but also the impact that disease has on that person as well as the family. So I think that's really critical. And it takes just a listening and a caring healthcare provider to, validate the symptoms that, that patient is feeling.
Thank you, Jennifer. So now we'll turn to Ipsen's Iqirvo, or elafibranor, that recently was approved in the EU as the first new treatment for PBC in almost a decade. So what exactly does this mean for patients?
Yeah, we're really pleased to bring this new class of medicines to patients with PBC. So Iqirvo was approved in Europe recently, in the US and the UK. And why that's important, as you mentioned, there's really been no new treatment introduced for patients during the last decade. And the first-line treatment of this disease, but 40% of patients don't respond. And so there were no options that were safe and effective for patients. So now there is a treatment that can be used as a second-line therapy that hopefully will improve their symptoms. We talked about the fatigue, the itching, as well as the brain fog, and hopefully also delay the progression of that liver inflammation we talked about that can lead to cirrhosis. And so we're looking at this drug as well long-term to look at these long-term outcomes. So it's really an exciting time for patients in the community of PBC, because I think for the first time in over a decade, there is hope for a potential treatment for this disease.
Thank you, Jennifer. And so if we focus on our, so to speak, trio of themes today, rare diseases, PBC, but also importantly, as discussed, women's health, in your opinion, what's the future horizon look like for all of those, given that research and development is already underway?
Thank you, Nicole. I think just having this podcast, for example, is a good way to educate. So I think discussing the gender inequalities in healthcare is critical overall. I think giving people the power to take care of their health and to talk knowledgeably and to be ensured that they're getting treated for their symptoms is really critical. And I think the time is really right now for exciting new innovation in rare diseases, as well as looking at more personalized medicine. I think it's really critical that we continue to invest in rare disease research, because of the 7,000 rare diseases, only about 96% of them have a treatment. So it's really important to continue that innovation. It's really important to provide hope for patients by working on new classes of drugs to help to ensure that, whoever they are, wherever they are, these drugs can be provided for them. And the other hope I really have is also that we decrease the time to diagnosis and misdiagnosis. So I think by further educating, increasing the knowledge of patients and healthcare providers, also changing the culture and looking more into gender-based science, so that we can really very early on ensure that we're providing, the best medicines for patients at the right dose and to take at the right time, is truly an exciting time to be in research and development.
Exciting indeed. Thank you so much for your time today, Jennifer. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Have a good day.
And so that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous instalments at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podbean, and pretty much wherever you get your other podcasts. Just search for pharmaphorum and press subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us as well on X or Twitter and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.